Welcome to Off Brand by Cocokind. I'm Priscilla Tsai, Cocokind's founder and CEO, and each week I get into the real, unfiltered side of building a brand alongside our community and creating substantive beauty products. We don't believe in trying to be anyone but ourselves, and we don't think you should either. So come along as we get real and imperfect, go deeper on topics most beauty companies won't, and get a bit off brand. Hi everyone, welcome back to Off Brand by Cocokind. Today we are going to be doing a myth busting of the ingredient list. There are so many things that I see on social media, whether it's people sharing it in their own social posts or comments or questions that we get, that make me realize just how misunderstood the ingredient list is or the inky list is. And I want to dive into some of those myths that I think are the most common misconceptions today on this podcast. But first, maybe let's just do a general check in. What's going on in the Cocokind world? So this month has been absolutely crazy. Now we're in our third week of our brand end cap at Ulta Beauty. This is our first ever brand end cap, and it's been going pretty well for us. I wouldn't say like incredible, but I would say pretty well. Generally, as a brand, we're crushing it at Ulta. But when we look at this end cap, we look at the stores that have this end cap, which is about 1,000 of them. We look at the sales that we had from those stores versus the sales that we had before the end cap went live, and we compare that to the other stores and the change in those stores to then figure out what is the lift that we're getting from this end cap. I would say so far it's pretty in line with expectations. It didn't beat our expectations. It's not significantly worse, but it's doing okay. You know what though? In the context of it actually being a really difficult year for skincare, doing okay is actually doing really great. So I'm still pretty happy with it, and definitely want to thank all the people in our community that are going out to stores, supporting the end cap, sharing the end cap, buying from the end cap. Even if you're not spending any dollars at Ulta on Cocokind, just sharing it and telling your friends about it, that means so much to us. And we've seen such an outpouring of people sharing our end cap. We've even seen a lot of people helping to fix our end cap and put the products where they should be, or make it back in stock, or clean up the shelves a little bit, get them a little bit more in line. And I can't even believe that that is what our community does for us. And I feel so lucky. We all feel so lucky here at Cocokind team that we have really an extension of our team in our customer community. So thank you so much for supporting us in all the little and big ways that you do, whether it's through your dollars or your voice or your actions in stores. It really means everything to us. So that end cap is getting taken off August 30th, which will be so sad. I'm recording this on August 21st. So we have 9 more days of this end cap. So we hope to finish it off really strong. We also have at this point, as of today, August 21st, we have announced 4 people that we're taking to New York. And I think by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be 5 people. So the 4 people that we're taking to New York that we've announced already are Kelsey, Paige, Amanda, and Noah. We're so excited about this group so far. We are not totally finalized on who are the total 8 people who are coming with us, because truly it's been so difficult to narrow it down through all of your shares and your posts and your comments and your reviews and your DMs to us and everything. It's been so amazing to see all of your support and everybody just showing their passion for Cocokind. We honestly have a really hard task in front of us to narrow it down at these last stages. We will continue to announce winners every couple days. So really in like a matter of 2.5 weeks here, all the 8 people would be chosen. And we even just let one of our teammates know, Jenny, that she's coming with us to New York. We let her know this week. We just did a Cocokind retreat. That's another thing that we did this week. We had a Cocokind team retreat. And so maybe some of you guys don't know, but around like 50% of our team actually lives elsewhere, whereas the rest of us live in the Bay Area. Every quarter or so, we fly out everybody to the Bay Area and we do a little team retreat where we do tons of dinners and fun activities. We went to Valkyrie's game. We did a game show experience. If there's one thing about Cocokind team, it's that we love games. We did a lot of like brainstorming activities just about like what products we want to see in the future. How can we improve our products? How can we improve our brand positioning, etc. And overall, we just kind of have this like nice time to be with each other, work with each other, hang out with each other. And it's always such a grounding week for us. So we just finished that this week. And in this retreat, we actually told Jenny, who has been with the company for, I think, over 4 years or something, we told her that she's going to be coming to New York with us. So very excited for all of you to get to know Jenny and to meet her as well. So we've done the team retreat. We have the Cocokind brand end cap. We've announced 4 or 5 people coming to New York with us. This week, we actually hosted our summer sale. So we have 3 sales a year: a spring sale, summer sale, and Black Friday, in terms of like a bigger site-wide sale. And that was also really successful. We're so happy and appreciative of everybody showing their support for us on our website. We know it takes a lot to interact with the website, actually. And so we really appreciate you coming to cocokind.com, because it does make a difference for us. And it is such a really nice nice part of our business, and we feel like we have a closer relationship with the people who buy from us on our website. So we try to build these really important moments to support our website sales. And so when we meet our goal, it's really awesome. So thank you so much for doing that. And there's even people who have reached out to us like, hey, like I noticed this on the website that wasn't correct, or I noticed this was like a weird issue on the website. And like honestly, all those things help us so much because we immediately see that, whether it's a DM or an email or whatever it is, and we surface it to our web team and our developers, and we immediately try to fix these issues. So there's always things that pop up. Actually, running a site-wide sale is really intensive. Every single sale we have, there's always like these little bugs that happen that we're trying to real time actively fix. So it's high pressure. So kudos to the web team for really holding down the fort. And of course, our ops team for planning all the inventory. So we didn't go out of stock of anything. I'm recording this Thursday at 10 a.m. We have not gone out of stock of anything. We don't try to go out of stock because that's not what we're trying to do. We would lose sales in that situation. You don't get the products you want. We try as hard as we can to keep all of our products in stock. I know there are a couple of products that have been in stock for quite some time that we weren't able to come back in stock for the sale, but we are still working on those, or we're evaluating those type of products. So appreciate the patience for those. But all the products that started in stock remained in stock for our summer sale. And we don't believe in scarcity marketing. And hopefully everybody had like a calm experience shopping the sale, knowing that there was going to be inventory of your favorites. So we've had a really, really busy month and we're still going. We have a lot happening in September, and I'll share more about all that going forward. But we are a team that stays booked and busy, and I'm really excited about all the momentum that we accomplished for ourselves really this summer. Usually summer is actually a slow time for skincare brands. I don't know if you all know that, but we have been doing really well, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much. Okay, now let's get into today's topics. I have some notes here because we just were so excited to talk about some of these things that exist and these misunderstandings about an ingredient list that I just really want to break down for you, because people really look at an ingredient list and try to do all this like matrix style math and science to characterize a product and really tell a story about a product. And definitely the ingredient list is a tool. It tells you about the product, but does it tell you the full story? Absolutely not. I like to compare an ingredient list to like a cover of a book. You're definitely getting an idea of what the book is about, but you're not getting the real substance at all by looking at an ingredient list. And I understand why we do that. The ingredient list is where you learn the most about a product on a box, on the packaging. So of course you're like really diving into that. But I just want to share a couple of misconceptions that I commonly see, especially on social media, when it comes to the observations that people take away from an ingredient list. Like I said, an ingredient list we believe is a guide for you, but it does not tell the full story. So let's get into some of the most common myths that people tend to believe when they look at an ingredient list today. Okay, so the first myth I want to get in today about ingredient lists is that you can tell how efficacious or how expensive a formula is by looking at the ingredient list. Just the idea that ingredient lists can tell you and help you compare performance of two products, that is a reach. And there's something that I don't think most people realize, and that is that in the US, you are required to order all the ingredients in descending order until you hit the 1% line. There are a lot of ingredients under the 1% line in most skincare products. An example of that might be maybe a preservative, maybe an active ingredient, maybe your hero ingredient. Like for instance, we use 0.1% retinol in our beginner retinol, maybe ceramides, maybe a complex of an active you're using, maybe a pH adjuster. There are a lot of different functions and reasons why an ingredient might be under 1%, and anything under 1% can be ordered however you want. This is something that has always bothered me. It bothers me because we have played into the rules that the industry has kind of established. Once upon a time, I was really strict and I said, hey team, we're going to list everything on the ingredient list, no matter what, whether it's under 1% or not, we're going to list everything in descending order. And then we would get so many questions from people like, hey, why is this ingredient on the bottom of your list? Or why is this ingredient, at the last few ingredients on your ingredient list? Or like, why is this ingredient so high on your ingredient list? I realize as a consumer, you don't know where the 1% line is. And every single brand out there is reordering under 1%. We took back that rule because we were getting so many perceptions of what our product formulation was based on our made up rule that we're going to have everything be straight up on descending order. So we stopped doing that. So even for us today, we order anything under 1% however we want. And we honestly have to play in so much to the perception of an ingredient list. And it really is something that drives me nuts, but I want to do more education about that so that we can just be more straightforward with our ingredient list. But unfortunately, every other company out there in the beauty industry is just ordering everything under 1%. 1%, however they want. That's kind of standard practice. And so if you deviate from that, when you get compared to brands, brand by brand, ingredient list to ingredient list, oftentimes we won't look as good. And it's really just because people don't understand that there's this exception to the rule of ordering your ingredients on a list. So I want to make sure all of the education starts here today. And I want to make sure you all know here in the fam, and you can spread it, that anything under 1% can be listed in whatever order you want. This is for the US. That's not necessarily true for other countries. Many countries have different regulations. So oftentimes there'll be different packaging for different countries, even with the same exact formula. And that's just based on ingredient list regulations and disclosure regulations. And that's honestly a whole nother topic, because I see a lot of people talk about this in food and skincare products where like, this is the product in the EU and they have this ingredient in the US and it's not listed in the EU one. So they took it out because it's banned in the EU. And honestly, sometimes it's the exact same formula. It's just a difference in the regulation and the disclosure requirements. That's a whole nother topic. Getting back to this topic though, ingredient lists, like I said, descending order, but anything under 1% can be ordered in however way you want. So as a brand, you might have 3 ingredients under 1%, or you might very well have 20 ingredients under 1%. Fragrance can be a blend of so many different types of ingredients. One fragrance, one scent could be like 12 different ingredients, all these different extracts and everything. And so you might have all of those under 1%, and you have a lot of room as a brand to play with. Okay, well, let's put this active ingredient above all those other extracts, even though it's actually in there at a lesser amount under 1%. So please keep that in mind, that you don't know as a consumer where that 1% line is. So when you see something and it's positioning on an ingredient list, that does not necessarily mean it's reflective of how much it is compared to other ingredients lower on the ingredient list. It could just be that all of those ingredients are under 1%. That is a very important fact just to understand as you evaluate ingredient list to ingredient list, and you kind of derive your own conclusions about the performance of a product based on an ingredient list. And as part of that myth where people think about reading an ingredient list to understand the performance level or the actives in an ingredient list, another big misconception that I want to myth bust is just the fact that the higher percent of actives are always better. I will see this on TikTok and social a lot, where people will say like they have this ingredient, but it's lower on the list. So many actives are clinically proven at low percentages. Period. End of story. That is so real. Not only that, you will oftentimes see brands like us talk about complexes, because we'll talk about peptide complex or ceramide blend, things like that, where the actual clinicals of those raw materials are done at a complex level. It's like one ingredient that we buy from a raw material manufacturer, but that includes maybe the peptides, maybe the delivery system of those peptides, maybe a preservative for that raw material peptide. That blend, that complex, is what those raw material ingredient houses will test at clinical levels. But it doesn't mean that, let's say it's a peptide in that complex, it doesn't mean that the peptide is in there at, call it 3%. The ingredient house will sell you a raw material. They will then clinically test this raw material, oftentimes, if they're a good manufacturer, at a certain percentage. So they might tell you, hey, this peptide complex is clinically shown to do XYZ things at 3%. But then within that complex, you actually then get to, maybe you have peptide, maybe you have water or glycerin in there, and maybe you have a preservative for that ingredient in that complex too. And the actual peptide in that complex might only be 1% of that complex. So let's say you're using 3% of that blend, the actual peptide in it might be in the final product at 0.3%. I know that sounds little, and I know that sounds wild, and I know that sounds not efficacious, but that is actually the reality of peptides. That is how we're formulating things. That is why you might not see a peptide at the top of your ingredient list. And if you do, and if it's in the middle of your ingredient list, it probably still is under 1%. It's just that the brand is ordering it at the top of what's under 1%. Does that make sense? It's all very industry speak. Everybody in the industry knows this. So it is really important for you to understand that. And it doesn't mean that 0.3% of that peptide in a peptide complex used at 3% in a formula is ineffective. Like I said, the ingredient houses, they're doing clinical studies at those levels. And those are the levels that a good brand will use that raw material in their final formula, because it's been clinically proven at a certain level. But it does not mean that the actual inky, like the peptide inky in that blend, is in there at 3%, or it might be in there at 0.3%. So people will oftentimes say that the actives need to be at the top of the ingredient list, and they'll compare where one product is to the other based on how high an active is in the ingredient list. And there are so many reasons why that method of analysis will fail. You don't know what complex it is, you don't know the clinical studies for it, and you also don't know what the 1% line is to know how much is actually in a formula. Formulation context is truly everything, and you don't get any of that context from an ingredient list. Different actives may have different percentages. And not only that, the same active from different vendors, different ingredient houses might be clinically tested at different levels. So you might have one ceramide blend that's been tested at 3% and another one that's been tested at 0.5%. That is also real. And it doesn't mean that the 0.5% one is any worse than the 3% one. Actually, you have to look at the clinical data. You have to look and verify and compare the clinical data. And oftentimes, like the 0.5% one is going to be just as expensive when you put it into the formula at 0.5% as a one that's at 3%, right? So you really can't tell efficacy by an ingredient list. And even for the same ingredient, there can be very different levels of efficacy based on who is making the ingredient and what testing they did at different levels. So that's another reason why more doesn't mean better. You can have the same ingredient from different vendors and achieve really same results, but the ingredient composition is totally different, even though it has the same inky, and it can be achieving totally different results at different levels. So more does not always mean better. Now, if you were looking at the exact same ingredient from the same vendor and they had clinical studies that said, hey, the range to use this is at 0.5% to 2%. At 0.5%, you might get a benefit of skin barrier support. And at 1% or 2%, you get the benefit of skin barrier support and lasting hydration for 24 hours. In that context, where you're literally just comparing the exact same ingredient from the same vendor and they give you a range, you can then have a conclusion that I'm getting more if the brand is using this at 2% than I am at 0.5%. And there's a lot of nuances when it comes to what percent of an ingredient is in a formula and what that means for the overall efficacy of a formula. What you'll also notice is that because of this 1% rule where you can order anything however you want, a brand might have an ingredient that is a preservative or something that maybe they don't want it to be the last ingredient because it's very obvious and your consumer eye sees that so quickly. So they'll put it strategically in kind of like the middle of the bottom half of the ingredient list to just kind of hide it. There's a lot of playing around to do under 1% line. I almost wish that the US had regulation that just said everything must be in descending order, including 1%. It would just make things more simple for you to understand ingredient lists and to compare ingredient lists. But instead, because of that 1% rule, it basically means that the story for an ingredient list is not really told and you can't compare one product to another just on an IL alone. Just continuing on this myth about why you can't tell performance by an ingredient list, a lot of times you can't tell things like encapsulation or a delivery system by an ingredient list, how well the formula penetrates or interacts with each other. Like you really don't know a lot of that, and it can be quite hard to tell that if you just look at the ingredient list. Okay, moving on to the next myth, I want to talk about water on the ingredient list because a lot of people will also assume that water on an ingredient list means that you're basically just paying for water. And that is such a misconception because water is a delivery system. Most skincare products, except for truly only oil skincare products, most skincare products will have water in them, except for the ones that are really 100% oils or anhydrous. And when you have water on the ingredient list, it serves as a delivery system, right? Like having that absorption and that hydration too. Like water is an OG hydrator. For your skin, it's also hydrating too. And for most skincare products that are not anhydrous, the water is going to be your delivery system. So for most products, water is going to be the first ingredient on a list. Water might be in there at 50%, 60%, 70 or 80 or even 90%. It doesn't tell you about the other 10, 20, 30, 40% of the formula. There are actives in there. There are other ingredients in there that are making up, of course, the cost versus water. So if you looked at a product and you said this one had 60% water versus this one that had 30% water, you wouldn't be able to say that the one with more water is actually cheaper. Not at all. So please don't think anything less of a product if you see water as a first ingredient on an ingredient list. What the percent of water in a formula can tell, not that you would even see that as a consumer, is just the more water there is, the more liquidy it is. That really is like the end story. That really is the truth. Like if something has 50% water versus something that has 90, most likely the 50% water is more of like a thicker emulsion, like a rich cream. And something like a 90% water is going to be like a watery toner, right? Like our magnesium mist is a great example of that. So it just tells you how watery something it is, but it doesn't tell you how expensive the formula is because you have no idea how expensive the other 10% of a formula is. Water for a lot of skincare products is a crucial base for the formula. Now, if I were to compare a cleanser, one that had the same 20% of ingredients and one just had water and the other one that just had oil as a 80%, but the 20% was exactly constant. And that honestly in real life wouldn't be the case. This is just a demonstrative example because if something is 80% water versus something is 80% oil, you wouldn't be able to have the same other 20%. But let's just say, for example, there's a cleanser, one of them is 80% water and 20% of other ingredients. And then this other cleanser, that 20% of other ingredients is the exact same. It just has 80% oil. I could then tell you for sure that the 80% oil one is much more expensive because oils are much more expensive than water, which is free 99 for a brand. Oils are not free. Some oils can be very expensive. And so if there's a formula with 80% oils, especially a cleanser, like that's our oil to milk cleansing balm actually is around 80% oils, that base is going to be really expensive. So you could call that the base, right? Like the base of an oil cleanser is going to be really expensive compared to the base of a water cleanser. That does not mean the full formula cost is necessarily so much cheaper because again, you don't know what's in the non-base parts of that formula. But you could compare the bases of a formula and you could just say an oil base is going to be much more expensive than a water base because water is free. Okay, moving on to my next myth. My next myth is just pore clogging ingredients. That's the myth. There are many brands out there that have lists on their website where they talk about being free from pore clogging ingredients. Once upon a time, I really believed in that. As a consumer, was really focused on trying to avoid any products that had these pore clogging lists. I think there are even apps out there where you scan an ingredient list and it tells you like which ones are pore cloggers. I think by probably the same companies are developing these apps. And the analogy that I always use is that buy an ingredient list, you just see an ingredient, you have no idea what form that ingredient comes from. You have no idea what percent it's used in, what type of ingredient, how it's processed. There's so much you don't know about an ingredient just by looking at ingredient lists. And the analogy I always like to use is butter and soup. So when I make a soup, I might saute the vegetables in like 1 tablespoon of butter. Imagine if I told you a whole pot of soup had 1 tablespoon of butter. You'd be like, okay, no problem. Imagine if I told you that 15% of that soup was butter. Or imagine if I told you that a third of that soup was butter. That's very different than a tablespoon. 1 tablespoon, it's totally fine. A third of a soup, absolutely not fine. That's the same for ingredients and how it quote unquote may or may not clog your pores. Some ingredients might be used at 0.5%, and some ingredients might be used at 5% or 15%, and how it acts on your skin can be totally different. A good example of that is actually shea butter, where shea butter in some formulations might be 100%, right? You have actual shea butter that people use. And if you took 100% shea butter and you put that on your face, yeah, it's going to probably be way too heavy for your skin. There might be a formula out there that uses 0.5% or even 1% of shea butter. And in a broader formula emulsion, it most likely is going to be totally fine, but it's definitely going to act differently than 100% shea butter, right? Another good example of that is like algae. I see that a lot. I think algae is on these lists where, if you use 100% algae oil, okay, maybe fine. There's been some tests to show that it's comedogenic, but if you used 1% of an algae extract because it's shown to reduce inflammation and to be good for your skin in various different ways with antioxidant protection, and it's a totally different format, that's completely different. So a lot of times people will say like, oh, I have to avoid algae. No, you have to avoid what type of algae, what form of it, what percent of it, because algae oil is completely different than algae extract. A lot of times these lists will just put every form of ingredient on their list, and it is just totally false. It's not only the ingredients that are false on this list, it is the percent and the context of how an ingredient is used in a formulation. It is the supplier, the processing information that they have no idea about when they put this list together. And it's ultimately how that ingredient interacts with your overall formula that none of that context exists. So I have a real problem with slapping on an ingredient into a banned list for people who are acne prone. Trust me, I'm very acne prone, but because I'm a product developer, I just know how many holes there are to poke in these lists and all the things they're not taking into consideration that make these lists totally useless. Not only that, there's just the fact that how an ingredient interacts for you might be different than how it interacts for me. That is the reality. And that makes it also very hard to determine, how an ingredient will respond for you and me. And we could both be exactly the same acne prone. As someone who's acne prone, I know how frustrating that is because you just want to look at an ingredient list and be like, nope, I can't use that, and just throw it away. But what I would say is like your ultimate guide, for me at least, is just how something feels on your skin. You have to try a product. And maybe for a lot of people, like for acne prone individuals, you kind of have to avoid like richer occlusives potentially. But overall, like it's very hard to determine that by an ingredient list without trying it on your skin. At the end of the day, going to be more powerful than anything is just how something actually feels on your skin. As someone who's acne prone, I can tell if maybe something is sitting too heavy or maybe something's sitting too sticky. And a lot of times when things are too sticky, my breakouts will worsen. And so, it's just kind of like a personal thing, but that also doesn't mean, which is tricky, that like everything that is heavy is not going to work for my acne prone skin. Like our resurrection polypeptide cream, I use it every single day, twice a day, no problems with that whatsoever. So it's not just that like something is sitting heavy. It's honestly just like the way that it's feeling on your skin. We would really encourage our customers to not use these lists because I find them to be really misleading and really, at the end of the day, untrue. What they ultimately serve as is a marketing tool for those companies, which is annoying that there are companies that prioritize that over facts. Any experienced product developer will know that there are so many ways that an ingredient might look the same on an ingredient list, but perform totally differently on your skin or based on how you use it in a formula. So I just find those lists, especially coming from skincare brands, to be really awful and misleading. And we know that they are not taking into consideration a lot of different factors, probably purposefully. I'm very empathetic to consumers in that situation because you see those lists and you want to trust them and you're looking for a solution ASAP on what ingredients should I not use. I don't want to break out more from my skincare products. And so I'm very empathetic to that. But unfortunately, there really is not a good solution. And those lists are very, very misleading. And the next myth that I want to talk about is that you can tell an ingredient's function based on the ingredient list. Some people don't realize this, but ingredients can play multiple different functions based on how it's formulated. Just because you see an ingredient on the ingredient list doesn't mean it's doing the function that you're used to it doing. So, a really good example of this is lactic acid. So, lactic acid over 5 or 10% is an exfoliator. It's an AHA, alpha hydroxy acid. But lactic acid is used in many, many formulas as a pH adjuster at under 1% levels. And under 1% levels, lactic acid not only is a pH adjuster and not only is it not exfoliating your skin, it's actually acting more of like a humectant, which means it's bringing hydration into your skin. It is not exfoliating your skin under 1%, or really anything under 5%, really. And a lot of times people will see that on an ingredient list and they will have this conclusion that this is an exfoliating product and it's really just doing something completely different. A lot of ingredients will have different functions depending on what percent you use it at. This is a problem that we deal with in our ceramide serum actually, because our ceramide serum has lactic acid in there at 0.6% as a pH adjuster. We will oftentimes hear people talk about that it's exfoliating, so much so that we are thinking about reformulating it without lactic acid next year as we try to think of like the next stage of this product and the improvements that we can make just to avoid that misconception. It is a misconception because the lactic acid in there at 0.6%, it's really in there for pH. It's not exfoliating your skin at all. So if you really want to know what something is doing, I would trust the brand for telling you the stories about the ingredients they use and why they use it. And if you're not getting enough, I think it's always safe to just ask the brand. Another one of these examples is fragrance or ingredients that contribute to fragrance. You might see a brand say no added fragrance, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's not a scent. If you turn around the ingredient list, there might be like 5 or 6 extracts that are contributing to a scent, right? So it could be like an apple extract, a peach extract, whatever it is. It might not say fragrance or it might not say an essential oil, but scent could be coming from a lot of the fruit extracts that are in the formula. Some of those extracts might have data to be powerful antioxidant or exfoliator or whatever it might be, but a lot of times those extracts are used in there for the sensorial properties of a scent. Again, you might just not know from looking at an ingredient list. Those ingredients can oftentimes be actually used in there for scent, not for the skincare benefits. Another example of that is oil free. We're actually really careful about not calling things oil free. And actually, there are a lot of companies that have kind of gotten in trouble about this because they will say oil free, but it's just because they're not having on their ingredient list like, oh, jojoba oil or avocado oil or grapeseed oil. Just because ingredient list doesn't list an outright oil doesn't mean it's oil free, because there's a lot of different ingredients that are actually oils or derived from oils or derivatives of oils or one step further in processing than the oil itself, but they're still oils and they're not called an oil. An example of this is going to be caprylic triglyceride, which is basically a processed version of coconut oil that is non-comedogenic. It's much more lightweight than coconut oil. Coconut oil says coconut oil on the ingredient list, where cap just says cap on the ingredient list, and it's a totally different form of that same ingredient. So just because an ingredient list doesn't list an outright oil does not mean there might not be fatty acids from an oil or some processed form of an oil on the ingredient list. And typically those names are unrecognizable to most consumers. So those are the myths that I wanted to bust today. And I'm realizing as I'm recording this that there are so many other myths that I want to bust. So I think we're going to have to do a part two, maybe even a part three. Maybe this is just an ongoing series as part of the podcast. If there are any things that you are not sure about and you hear about it and you're like, is this a myth or is this true? And you want my opinion on it, definitely let us know. I really hope this helps with furthering real education, not marketing. Education on skincare products and how they're developed. And I recognize that some of what I'm saying makes it harder for you because you're like, oh, I thought that I could have this conclusion or I thought that I could have this observation. Now I realize I can't. Unfortunately, that is the reality, which is why companies like us, we just really believe in like just talking about the ingredients we use, talking about how we formulate, talking about how we develop, providing a lot of information on our box so that you can make an informed decision. Unfortunately, it can be really hard to compare that though to other brands that don't provide that information. So we try to do the best we can. We're going to continue to educate you so that you know what questions to ask. But currently, unfortunately, the burden is on consumers to ask the questions. That's all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for learning with us. And if you have any myths that you want me to bust, feel free to send me a DM and I'll see you next week.